What's your take on xenohormesis and the benefits of consuming these wild plants, where they're saying that this plant paradox kind of thing, that there's certain wild fruits and vegetables that you should avoid completely because of the damage that it could potentially do to your digestive system?
Well, there's two considerations there. There's this idea, of course, that we've already raised of hormesis, which essentially is roughly translated as the things that would kill you in large amounts are good for you in small amounts, right? We know that sunlight radiation is actually good for you. You need some amount of UVA and UVB exposure, but large amounts can cause a lot of oxidative damage and burning of the skin, and even potential risk for skin cancer in excess. And so you're looking at brief amounts of sun exposure being good, large amounts being not so beneficial. Same thing with exercise, right? We know that one of the reasons that exercise works is you damage muscle fibers, you cause inflammation that would kill you. If you were to work out like 6 hours a day, you wouldn't last very long. But we know that smaller amounts are actually good for you. We know the same thing for heat, right? Like sauna, the Finnish men's longevity study showed that men who had a regular sauna practice, live 4 to 5 years longer and have a remarkable decrease in risk of things like Alzheimer's and dementia and diabetes. Yet if you were to sauna every day for like 2 hours, you'd have a lot of mineral depletion and you would have some cardiovascular issues. We know that any of these things in large intake can actually be bad for you, which is why, if you were to say, hear me talk about the xenohormetic benefits of wild plants or of some of these built-in plant defense mechanisms, and you were to start to put giant handfuls of broccoli sprouts and kale and spinach into a morning smoothie and have these huge salads during the day, what happens is you can actually cause excess damage. There's a law of diminishing returns. And furthermore, some of these compounds like wheat or oat or barley or rye or some of the fruits that have seeds in them, like tomatoes, cucumbers, etc., and seeds and nuts like almonds and cashews and pumpkin seeds and flax seeds, etc., you're getting a really, really high intake of potential gut damaging and nervous system damaging type of compounds like lectins and glutens and phytic acid inhibitors and a lot of things that will inhibit your absorption of minerals or cause damage to the gut. And so the solution is not to completely avoid those type of compounds, but it is to instead deactivate a lot of these natural built-in plant defense mechanisms so that you're getting trace amounts, but not large amounts. And so that comes down to more of an ancestral approach, right? The use of soaking and fermenting and sprouting. People will hear that quinoa, for example, is a super grain or a super grass that's very good for you. And quinoa it's very high in fatty acids and amino acids. It's a very nutrient dense grain or grass really. But you have to, for example, when you buy quinoa, a lot of people hear that, they'll go buy quinoa, they'll make quinoa, and they'll have like some stomach upset or gas or bloating or see little pieces of quinoa in their crap. And that's because quinoa is covered with a soap-like irritant called saponins. And to properly prepare quinoa, you're supposed to rinse it a few times and put it in a mason glass jar and leave it overnight. And then when you get up in the morning, rinse it again. And preferably after you've done that, even leave it in that glass jar in the pantry for a little while so you get little sprouts coming out of it. And then you prepare your quinoa and you've deactivated a lot of the plant defense mechanisms. As a matter of fact, in South America, when they prepare quinoa, they'll use that water that they rinse the quinoa with to clean their clothing because it's so high in soap. But of course, if you were to eat a bunch of soap, you can imagine what that would do to your GI tract. So what this comes down to is, you noted a guy like Stephen Gundry in the book, The Plant Paradox, and he encourages the use of things like a pressure cooker when you prepare your potatoes to deactivate a lot of the lectins, and peeling and de-seeding tomatoes, and soaking and sprouting and fermenting. And that's certainly something you also see in books like The Art of Fermentation. And so you have to be smart about the volume of the plant matter that you eat and the manner in which it's prepared. You're never going to fully deactivate a lot of these plant defense mechanisms, but that's kind of the goal, is you're getting trace amounts of them throughout the day without excess intake. And part of this too comes down to intuitive eating, comes down to paying attention to bloating and gas and GI symptoms, because there's an author named Fred Dispenza who wrote a book called Nourishment. which is about how animals self-select food. And if you let a bunch of sheep or goats out into a field, you'll find that the animals will eat a certain amount of the younger plants where you have a lot more of the antioxidants concentrated. Mm-hmm. And a lot more of the plant defense mechanisms concentrated, because a younger plant does a better job kind of taking care of itself and producing a lot of these. And then the animal will only eat a very small amount of that and then move on to the older plants, which tend to have more of the nutrient density, but less of the built-in plant defense mechanisms. And interestingly, in studies, they've given some of these animals anti-nausea medication. And upon given anti-nausea medication, these animals will go out and eat ad libitum all of the young plants, right? And overdo their intake of natural built-in plant defense mechanisms because you've deactivated the nausea mechanism that would normally kick in. And so they do damage to themselves because they've lost the ability to be able to intuitively eat. And what we can learn from that as humans is that, if we shift towards a large intake of plants and herbs and spices, and we pay attention to how we feel when we do that, and then we also combine that with fermentation, with soaking, with sprouting, with a more ancestral approach to preparing our plants, then we can begin to enjoy a wide variety of plant matter and herbs and spices, and particularly, wild plants and things like that. But also we'll know if we're eating too much just based on paying attention to our bodies. Mm-hmm. And that might even include, more smart methods of self-quantification, like wearing a blood glucose meter to see how high your blood glucose spikes, or measuring your heart rate variability to see if your heart rate variability is staying high and if your nervous system is staying strong, or even using on a quarterly basis a test like Genova Diagnostics. They have a 3-day gut panel you can order to your house to test for things like inflammation, yeast, fungus, parasites, dysbiosis, bacterial markers, et cetera. And you can just order that to your house, and you collect stool for 3 days, and you store it in a FedEx package in your refrigerator, much to the chagrin of your spouse, keeping your poop in the refrigerator. And then after 3 days, you mail it out and you get some results. You can do some more smart self-quantification that goes beyond just intuition and listening to your body. But long story short is, you got to be careful with how much of these type of foods you consume, but it's not black and white. It doesn't mean, plants have defense mechanisms, therefore we shouldn't eat any of them at all. It's the same thing with red meat. It's like, red meat will spark a reaction that excessively, or to at least a very significant extent, activates mTOR, your body's growth mechanism, your body's anabolic mechanism, which, if triggered in very high amounts every single day, if you're eating ribeye steak for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, could potentially cause increased risk for carcinogenicity, or at least increase the aging process. However, that doesn't mean you can't enjoy a ribeye steak on Tuesday and Friday nights, right? Mm-hmm. And so it all comes down to moderation, and also some amount of self-quantification, or at least paying attention to how your body feels.